Christ formed in you for the sake of others. Welcome to the Wild Way Podcast.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 204 of A Slow Journey Through John. This is our week 29 Explore episode.
It's hard to believe we passed the 200 mark.
Yeah, who knew we would make it this far? So today we are into a brand new chapter. But before we do that, we should first do a couple things. Number one, we should just say welcome to our new narrator, Nathan, who's narrating chapter 12 for us.
Hi, Nathan. Thank you.
And the exciting thing is all the previous narrators have been friends of ours from where we used to live. And Nathan is the first reader from where we live now that we have met in the last few months.
So we've been living here for 11 months and we now have one friend to show for it.
Yes.
Listen, it's hard to make friends in a rural town when you don't work with adults.
That is true. When you work from home, it's tough.
Yeah, it's tough. So we are about to enter the last week of Jesus's life, and we'll see his priorities because he's very aware that he is about to die. And we see that he spends a lot of time hanging out with his friends. And it just got me thinking, Nick, if you knew that you had 1 week to live, what would you do? What are some things that you do? And I know there was actually a movie about this. It's called 1 Week. The guy found out he had 1 week to live, so he bought a motorcycle and drove all the way across the country. Yeah. Anyway,
in 1 week.
In 1 week, yeah.
Wow.
And what about you?
What I would do is if I knew I had a week, I would probably call all my family and talk to them. I would try to get people on my last or second to last day. I'd try to have everyone gather together and talk. And I would really want to spend my last week blessing people and letting them know why I have appreciated them in my life. And of course, I would hang out all the time with you.
And so what, you'd leave all your listeners hanging? You wouldn't spend your last week frantically recording all the rest of the episodes?
I would leave it in your hands to do it.
All right. Thanks. You heard it here, folks. Yeah.
We should probably say, though, you're going to be narrating chapter 13. So when you hear Jamie in chapter 13,
he's still alive.
It doesn't mean I only have a week left to live. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's get to our recap of this past week. So we started the week with an imagination prayer based on Mary anointing Jesus in chapter 12, verses 1 to 7. And then we zoomed into this banquet at Bethany and we saw two expressions of worship. Martha expresses love through practical service, while Mary pours out this expensive perfume on Jesus's feet, wipes them with her hair. When Judas criticizes this as wasteful, Jesus defends her choice. And I really appreciated, one thing that really stood out to me is how we saw both activist and contemplative expressions of devotion as being beautiful to Jesus. And we'll get into that in a moment. And then came the triumphal entry, massive crowds, Jesus entering Jerusalem. They're expecting this political Messiah who's going to overthrow Rome. And instead, Jesus deliberately rides this humble donkey. And we'll get into what that means as well. So what stood out to you this week, Jamie?
Well, I always enjoy the imagination exercises you've been including recently. It's a way to kind of get out of my thinking head and into just sensing what God might be saying to me. I like that a lot. But my favorite part is I love the triumphal entry. I always love the triumphal entry, and especially how the people believed he was entering as this great warlord, but he was going to overthrow something far bigger than just Rome. What was your favorite part?
Well, my favorite part was what I mentioned, the whole activist / contemplative kind of worship. And I'm looking forward to that. Also, I wouldn't call this my favorite part, but there was a part that came up that we're going to talk about in a little bit that really brought up in me just some thoughts about the way we do church. It's specifically the way we do worship in church these days. And so we'll talk about that in a bit too. So for now, let's just jump into the banquet. John 11 ends with an arrest warrant for Jesus, and everyone is wondering what he will do as Passover approaches. And so this is what we read. Maybe you can read the first 3 verses.
6 days before Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, home of Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Lazarus and his sisters hosted a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who joined him at the table. Then Mary took an extraordinary amount, almost 3/4 of a pound of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She anointed Jesus' feet with it, then wiped his feet dry with her hair. The house was filled with the aroma of the perfume.
Okay. What catches your attention?
This has always been a passage I never really got. It's super hard. It's hard to understand in our context, and I think it was also strange in her own context. Like it feels uncomfortable to watch this.
Yeah, I remember you saying it's uncomfortable for us today, but it's scandalous for the people of the time.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we feel a little bit like, what? Like, didn't you have a dish rag? But yeah, I think it was even far more scandalous to the people watching, and that's why they all react.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just jump into that. So chapter 12 is kind of like a pivot chapter in John's gospel. It's the end of Jesus's public ministry. And so everything that he's going to be talking about after chapter 12, like that wonderful speech from chapter 13 to 17, that's all said in private to his disciples. And like we mentioned in the meditation, chapter 12 also marks the end of what is called the book of signs, which is the stories and events from John chapter 2 to John chapter 12 that records all the signs that Jesus does. After this, starting in chapter 13, is called the book of glory, and it's Jesus's final words to his disciples, his arrest, trial, crucifixion, resurrection. And so John tells us that we are 6 days away from Passover, which means it's a Saturday, and we're 5 days away from Jesus's arrest, and we're 6 days away from his crucifixion. So we're into his last week. And so we mentioned in the meditations how much, like almost 50% of John's gospel is given to this final week of Jesus's life.
To put that in context, it'll be about 4 months of meditations to get us through to the end.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
But even if you look at the other gospel accounts, this comes from David Guzik. He says that Matthew has 33%, so a third of his gospel is on the last week. Mark, 40% of his gospel is on the last week. For Luke, it's over 25%, all dedicated to 7 days in Jesus's life. That's a pretty important week.
Yeah.
So the setting here is a banquet, and we mentioned the meditation that Bethany means house of the poor, which has led some scholars to suggest that Lazarus and his family were poor. The flip side of that, of course, is that other scholars point out, well, they live in a house large enough to host a banquet, so they may have been financially stable or even well off. What do you think?
Considering Mary has this ridiculously expensive bottle of perfume nard, I don't think they're poor.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any impoverished person would have this frivolous thing of a jar of nard.
Yeah. The commentators who think they were poor would say that that was probably a family inheritance, or like a family heirloom almost, that was passed down. But here's a fun fact for you, Jamie.
Okay.
According to Matthew and Mark, it seems that this dinner was at the home of Simon the leper. And because John points out that Martha seems to be acting as the hostess, some think that Simon the leper was related to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, or even that he may have been Martha's husband. There you go.
Wow, I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah. Fun fact.
Did Simon the leper get healed by Jesus?
One would hope.
Why wouldn't they just call him Simon?
That's true. And then it would kind of suck for him if Lazarus got raised from the dead and I still have my leprosy.
But also he wouldn't be hosting banquets and having people in his house because leprosy was super contagious.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know. Anyway. So the first thing I want to talk about is Martha. We understandably focus on Mary in this story, but Martha plays a really important role because John tells us that she is serving. And based on the Luke 10 story of Mary and Martha, where Martha complains that Mary's not helping her in the kitchen, Mary's spending time at Jesus's feet, Martha gets a bit of a bad rap, I think. she's portrayed as a bit of a busybody who misses all the important stuff because she's more interested in doing stuff and busy serving.
But again, in our last week, we remembered that she had great faith, and it was her sister that was like, "Where were you? You weren't here." And it was her that was like, "You weren't here, but even now you can do something."
Yeah, yeah.
So I think she's got great faith.
Yeah, well, David Ford calls her a model friend. He says, loved, loving, believing, and now active in a practical way. So a model friend that loves Jesus, is loved by Jesus, believes in Jesus, like you just pointed out, with good faith, and now actually serving in some practical way. And we mentioned in the meditation that serving seems to be Martha's way of worshiping. We mentioned that, in verse 26, Jesus uses the same Greek word for serve as John uses here to describe what Martha's doing. And Jesus says, whoever serves me must follow me, which Martha does. Wherever I am, there my servant will be also. My Father will honor who serves me. And so that's high praise for someone like Martha who is serving Jesus.
However, at that time, that was her role. Like none of the men would have been serving. It wouldn't have been their role. It was a female's role to get up and serve.
Mhm.
And so we don't know if it was actually an act of worship because we don't know what her heart was. If she was still resentful, like she was when Mary was sitting at Jesus's feet the first time, is she resentful now? Do you know what I mean? Is her heart a heart of worship, or is she still resentful like she was before? Because this is just a role that she had to take. It was her job.
I actually think you can hold both. I think you can be both. This is the way I want to love and serve Jesus, and also feel a little, how come other people aren't doing the same thing and helping me out? Which we're going to get into in a second about the whole idea of the way people worship.
So what I see from this is if this is a case that this is her worshiping in service, then in any menial task that we are doing for others, we can use it as a way to worship if we have the right mindset.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like what Saint Athanasius says about this in the 4th century. He says, Martha herself was taking great care with the service and was ministering to Christ with all her heart. Mary herself was seated at the feet of Jesus and kissing them. Christ beholds them both with his divine eyes and is cheered and rejoices over the purity of their mode of life and the offering to him of their undefiled service. So, I mean, St. Athanasius thinks that Martha's service is pure and coming from a heart of worship.
Well, hopefully, but it's a lot of work to put on a feast by yourself. And once again, Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus. So hopefully it was a heart of worship.
Hopefully, yes. So the terms that we use in the meditations was activist to describe Martha and contemplative to describe Mary. So 2-part question for you, Jamie. First part, have you ever thought of Martha in this light before? As a worshiper honored by Jesus, as almost like an activist who is doing acts of service as an act of worship?
No, I haven't, because I've only ever been taught that she's the irritated sister stuck with all the chores while her sister gets to relax with Jesus. So she just, no one really says good things about her. She's just got a bad rap. But it's nice to think that perhaps she is offering up all this service with a correct heart as an act of worship to serve Jesus.
Yeah.
And because I know so many people who worship this way, who just they're humble servants who care for the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
absolutely.
that's what they bring to Jesus, and that's their role in the kingdom of God.
That's how they serve Jesus, is
Yeah.
by helping others and serving. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so second part of the question, what do you think of this whole sort of activist contemplative spectrum? Where would you put yourself on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say for my whole life previously, I was definitely on the activist spec part because I felt like I had to prove my worth and show God that I was worthy. So I threw myself into all kinds of ministry, like in way, way too much ministry. But now I understand that the rest at the feet of Jesus and the contemplation is even more important, because without that, I'm not going to be okay to actually serve people with a good attitude or selflessly, or to help people flourish, because I'll be resentful.
So would you say, do you find more joy in the contemplative practices or the active practices?
I find, well, probably both now. Like I really find great joy in the contemplative practices. And it took me a while to not feel guilty, because just being and receiving and not doing anything, like I had to get over that not feeling guilty. But I definitely find great joy in serving others as well.
The Martha in us sometimes makes the Mary in us feel a little guilty.
How about you?
I would say I lean more toward the contemplative side. I definitely find a lot of joy in that, but I also have noted that I have to be feeling well and healthy, like spiritually well and spiritually healthy, in order to really devote and find joy in those practices. I find that if I'm not doing as well, I tend to come further over to the activist side just so I can be busy. And it almost like it is an act of worship, but it's also a distraction from whatever is like roiling around inside of me. All right, so let's move on. And we've just talked about Martha. Now Mary enters the story. And this took a more courage than we realized because, like you said, the common custom was dinner was for the men of the village, and Martha and the other women would be expected to serve. So Mary was expected to be active like Martha, and in she comes, and
Yeah.
you might think that some might see that as an intrusion. Like, what are you doing here?
Well, it was against social norms. It was already scandalous. The fact that she went in to hang out with Jesus and not be over in the kitchen was already scandalous.
Yeah, yeah. And then she takes this bottle of very expensive nard. And so I worked it out. In today's terms, we're talking about a bottle of perfume worth around $40,000.
Crazy. So
Yeah.
crazy.
Crazy,
Yeah.
crazy expensive. And it's because nard came from India or like Nepal region, and it was so expensive because it was so hard to obtain. And because of that, it was normally used only for burial preparation or royal anointings or some very, very distinguished person.
And for her, it's all of the above.
Yeah, that's right. So she takes this bottle of perfume. The other gospel accounts tell us it was in an alabaster jar, which is sealed. And so you have to break the jar. Like you can't just pull off the stopper and take out a couple of drops and put it back in. You actually have to break, like it's a one use kind of thing. And so she breaks the jar, pours it all out on Jesus. But surprisingly, John points out that she pours it on his feet. However, Matthew and Mark point out she pours it on his head. So it was likely both poured out on his head and his feet. And even more surprising is she lets down her hair and wipes his feet with it. And so there's two things to point out here. First, whereas anointing someone's head symbolized honor or kingship or even like a prophetic commissioning, to anoint someone's feet symbolize humility, service, and deep personal devotion. And so, in doing this like this, Mary is, like you said, doing both at the same time. And the second thing, Mary lets down her hair, which we think is, okay, understandable. But in this culture, it was scandalous. So, this is how N.T. Wright compares it. This is what he says. He says, this is roughly the equivalent at a modern polite dinner party of a woman hitching up a long skirt to the top of her thighs. You can imagine the onlooker's reaction. Had she no shame? What was she trying to say to Jesus, to the onlookers? All sorts of disturbing thoughts must have been flying round the room.
Yeah. But I also, to my understanding, I mean, it's also scandalous just for a woman to simply be touching a man. Like that was also unheard of, right? So
Yeah.
there's just so many different levels of scandalousness here. I read something this week from Reverend Doit Kahn, and he said this. He said, it's a strange scene, a woman at the feet of Jesus during a party, rubbing an ointment for the dead on his feet and then wiping it with her hair. Really? The Jesus I want to follow is the one who says, oh, Mary, enough of that. Stand up and sit here next to me at the table. But instead, he lets her do it. Her act is even uncomfortable for Judas, who offers commentary on her excesses, maybe as a way of getting her up off that floor, but Jesus shuts him down.
Yeah, that would be my reaction too. My reaction
just
would
up the floor.
Yeah,
Come on,
yeah.
just get up.
Yeah.
You're making a fool of yourself.
No. My reaction wouldn't be you're making a fool of yourself. My reaction would be, come on, get up and just make yourself comfortable. Sit. Like I wouldn't want to be honored in that way.
And you wouldn't want to be the center of attention.
Yes.
You're having difficulty with it because it would be you put yourself in the
I would be
seat of
embarrassed.
Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
I put myself in the seat of the onlooker, but you put yourself in the seat of Jesus, whatever. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah. So we have this expensive and extravagant sacrifice. We have a deeply humble and personal devotion with no thought for what others may think. This is a really important thing. Like everyone would have been like gasping and questioning, and Mary
Terrible.
had no thought for it. Like she said, this is what I want to do, and I don't care what people think.
I'm just gonna wipe you up that perfume with my hair.
Yeah. And as mentioned in the meditation, John's gospel is all about God's abundance toward us. But here he writes this story that demonstrates this incredible act of abundance toward God.
Also, I think that because it was perfume, I can just imagine that this scent of this perfume would have followed Jesus all the way through. Like
Yeah.
it would have stayed with him all the way through that week.
Yeah. David Ford looks at this in chapter 11. He says there's two scent events, meaning two events with distinct smells. So in chapter 11, you have the stench of Lazarus's decomposing body. And here in chapter 12, you have this beautiful fragrance of perfume filling the air around the dinner table. And on top of that, nard was the main ingredient used in making the consecrated incense offered on the altar of the temple. And so smelling it would bring thoughts of temple worship and toward the temple. And so not only is Mary doing all these things we just talked about, there's also this idea of Jesus is the new temple. And it's also a hint at maybe at what lies ahead for him, because he's about to become an offering. And so this smell would have evoked all these thoughts in the people who were there.
And John, I'm sure, intentionally put that in there to evoke these thoughts.
So this extravagant worship with no care for what others think, like we said, is pretty incredible. And I think it's a feeling that not many of us can relate to. Like if you think about worshiping in a church, I'm very aware of who's around me and what's going on. And it's hard not to be aware of what others are doing around you. And if you do something that's different to them, it can feel uncomfortable. Like if nobody's raising their hands in church worship and you raise your hands, right?
Yeah. I've been around, I would say, extravagant worshipers many times. So I've seen people weeping, people who will prostrate themselves on the floor, people who dance, who raise their hands. And I envy that because I'm not usually able to be that free in communal worship. Because when I'm around others, I tend to be quite conservative. Yeah. You?
Yeah, I would definitely say I am more on the reserve side, not because I'm not worshiping,
Yeah.
but because that's just who I am.
Yeah. And, it is, I think, human nature to tend to judge people who might be worshiping a little more extravagant. Like, think of David in the Psalms when he was dancing and making a fool of himself, and his wife was like, David, you're making a fool of yourself. I just think there are people who would have that freedom to be able to worship extravagantly.
And we shouldn't look down on them.
Exactly. It's a beautiful act of worship.
That said, I have seen some extreme acts that become very much a distraction.
Yeah, I have also seen strange things, that are just distracting and don't lead anybody into worship.
And so I think the important thing is for the worshiper is, who are we doing this for? Are we doing this to be seen by others?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we doing it to worship the Lord? And if it is to worship the Lord, then it doesn't even need to be seen by others. Like you don't have to do it in front of people. It can be done privately as well. Okay, so far at this banquet, we have Martha, we have Mary, we have Jesus. Now more characters enter the story. So maybe you can read verses 4 to 11.
Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, complained, "This perfume was worth a year's wages. Why wasn't it sold and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He carried the money bag and would take what was in it. Then Jesus said, "Leave her alone. This perfume was to be used in preparation for my burial, and this is how she has used it. You'll always have the poor among you, but you won't always have me." Many Jews learned that he was there. They came not only because of Jesus, but to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. The chief priests decided they would kill Lazarus too. It was because of Lazarus that many of the Jews had deserted them and had come to believe in Jesus.
Okay. What catches your attention there?
Yeah, previously, Judas, he's been kind of this faceless disciple. He hasn't had any screen time. And then suddenly, John paints a picture of who he is. And he very clearly interjects in his own narrative to ensure we know that we're dealing with a bad guy here. He says, he didn't care about the poor. He was a thief. He was about to betray him. He took the money bag and he'd take what was in it. So, that shows what he thinks about Judas, and also shapes our perceptions of who Judas is as well. But I wish sometimes that we could hear Judas's side, because first of all, he was one of Jesus's 12 and he was the treasurer. So it's clear that Jesus trusted him and he chose him. So yeah, I'd like to hear more about Judas, but we don't have anything else. And I just remember, people aren't all evil. There must have been something good. He's not just this evil betrayer, thief. There must have been more to him if Jesus had him in his inner circle.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely have noticed that John, more than any of the other gospel writers, has a particular hate on for
Yeah.
Judas.
I think it's been many years since all of these events played out, but it's still like evoking some rage that he still needs to work through a little bit.
Yeah, and I remember actually reading a reflection once that the author was wondering what Judas was like as a child. Like, what pet name did his parents call him, really humanizing him. And it was something where, yeah, he was a human with foibles, but also he had good in him. And so, I mean, it's hard to say he gets a bad rap, but because he did betray Jesus, right?
He did betray Jesus, and
but
clearly he was stealing their money.
Yes, but there is more to the backstory that we don't get to see. And I too wish we could get the backstory. Yeah.
We'll be talking about him a lot more because he comes up 2 more times in big ways.
Yeah. Anything else stand out to you?
Just, poor Lazarus. Like, he didn't do anything wrong. He was happily dead. He didn't know anything, and suddenly he comes alive, and now people want to kill him again. So he's been alive for a few days, and people are trying to send him back to where he came from. But everyone is starting to realize very, very clearly that following Jesus can cost them their lives. And so they should probably stay out of Jerusalem. Yeah,
you would think so.
You'd think so.
Yeah, but they don't.
Yeah.
And so we just called Mary's worship an act of abundance toward God, but there are some there that we just read who disdain this abundance. John, throwing shade on Judas, only mentions Judas, but Matthew and Mark clarify it's all the disciples. Mark says some others get angry, and Matthew says all the disciples. So that includes John. So John is also angry, but he's just throwing shade on Judas at this moment.
Yeah, everyone's like, why are you doing this?
Yes.
Why are you doing this?
Yes. So Judas is the one that is basically speaking what's on everybody's mind. Maybe even Martha's mind as well, and maybe Lazarus's mind too. But before we come down too hard on them, if Lazarus and his family are poor, as some suggest, then it would be understandable to be freaking out at $40,000 used up in one thing here.
Yeah, if it was something that they had inherited, like you said earlier, they're probably all like, are you kidding me? You could have sold that and paid rent.
Yeah, exactly. But John also mentions another ulterior motive for Judas's criticism, like you've already pointed out. David Guzik says this is the only place in the New Testament where Judas is mentioned as doing something evil other than his betrayal of Jesus. And even this was done in secret. Judas successfully hid the darkness of his heart from everyone except Jesus. Outward appearances often deceive. Many people have a religious facade that hides secret sin.
And unfortunately, this is a theme that we've discussed in depth in previous Explore episodes. But just a reminder, as we've discussed before, be wise and wait to see people's character revealed under whatever religious things they project to the world.
Absolutely. The problem is that Judas and the disciples have this distorted view of reality. So they are calling something wasteful that Jesus thinks and calls beautiful, because they were determining value based on money, not on love or worship. They're like, that's $40,000 down the drain. What are you doing? And Jesus says, no, this is a beautiful act of worship. And I really like William Barclay's quote that we shared in the meditation. A warped mind brings a warped view of things. And if we find ourselves becoming very critical of others and imputing unworthy motives to them, we should for a moment stop examining them and start examining ourselves. And the reason I like that quote is, as I mentioned in the meditation, what we think about others often reveals more about us than about them. So the example I gave in the meditation was a liar will often suspect that people are lying to them because it's something they do, so they assume other people do it as well. Or a trustworthy person will often assume other people are trustworthy because they think they're going to act like them. But the criticism can also come because our values are not the same. So, for example, the whole idea of saving for retirement or taking a trip. And so, if a person values saving for retirement, they might look at another person who spends a bunch of money to take a trip around the world as wasteful. Like, why are you wasting your money on something like that? Whereas that person says, this is what's really important to me, and I would rather do this than have that sit in a bank for the next 20, 30 years.
So how does that play out in this situation with Judas and Mary?
Because for Mary, this is money well spent in one sense. It's like, I want to give this act of devotion and worship to Jesus. I want to totally extravagantly worship him. And Judas looks at it and says, that's a waste of money because he doesn't value worship like Mary does. He's saying, this is too wasteful. It's not worth it.
But also, if John is correct, they could have taken that for the ministry, sold it for 40 grand, and he could have skimmed off the top.
Yes, that's also true. But there was one commentator who said Judas knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, meaning he knew the financial cost of that act, but he did not see the value of that act like Jesus saw. Jesus thought it was beautiful.
Because this was truly the only proper anointing he did get for his burial. In proper Jewish burial, you would be anointed with an ointment like this all over the body before you get wrapped in the grave clothes. And nobody had time to do that later because it's Sabbath day. Nobody had time to properly anoint him. Right. That's why the women were coming back the next day. They were coming back to anoint him after the Sabbath was over.
Yeah, and in this instance, Jesus affirms Mary's priorities and her values. He tells everyone, leave her alone because she's the only one here that is seeing this rightly. And what I really like is how he gives her complete agency in how to express her worship. He says, this perfume was to be used in preparation for my burial, and this is how she has used it. It was her choice how to use the perfume in preparation for his burial.
Do you think, though, that she was aware that he was about to die, or was she just doing this as an extravagant act of worship? Like, I think she was just worshiping. She just needed to do this to worship him, but it just happened to coincide with the fact that he was going to die within the week. I don't think she had any idea.
Yeah, it's very possible, just like with Caiaphas, that she was like unwittingly prophetic in what she was doing. Like, whereas Caiaphas was unwittingly prophetic in what he said. So she may have had no idea that this was going to happen. Whether she understood what she was doing as this act of I'm preparing him for burial, or if it's just I love him and I want to worship him in this way, it still meant the same thing. He was being prepared for his burial. And I like the fact that Jesus gave her agency in how to use that oil.
He wasn't like, okay, stand up. Don't worry. You don't need to do this.
Yeah.
And he didn't stop her, or he didn't allow Judas to stop her. He protected her and allowed her to continue her worship.
Yes, in the way that she felt she needed to do.
Even though it was very strange.
Very strange. And I think this is important to us because we're told to worship God, but how we express our devotion to him, it's up to us and it's up to others. It was up to Mary how she was going to express her devotion. It wasn't up to Judas. It wasn't up to the other disciples. So who are we to say it's right or wrong to raise your hands or not raise your hands? And I do think we need to be cautious here because I have seen in modern worship settings where worship leaders become very prescriptive in telling people what to do and how to worship Jesus. And so let me ask you this. How many of these things have you heard in a church service? Okay, so first there are the physical commands, such as raise your hands if you love Jesus. Have you heard that?
Definitely. So you have to, because otherwise everyone will think you don't love Jesus.
Okay, how about clap your hands, everyone?
Yep.
Or sometimes calling out non-participation, like, hey, some of you aren't singing.
Some of you don't have your hands raised.
Yes, yeah. And the problem is that pressures people into outward actions without inward authenticity.
Mhm.
But it's not just physical stuff. There's also, I've seen emotional manipulation through the language, which implies our expression of worship is insufficient and it can induce guilt rather than worship. So things like, come on, you can do better than that.
Heard that for sure.
Or let's give God a shout of praise this time.
And then when that's not good enough, say, no, you can do better. Let's give a real shout.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely have heard that.
Okay.
Again, we're coming from charismatic backgrounds,
Yes.
though.
How about telling people what to feel, such as if you're really worshiping, you'll have a smile on your face.
Yep, I've heard that.
Or everyone should be joyful today. There's no room for sadness today.
That's awful.
So, and that doesn't allow us to be emotionally honest before God. The point is that everyone has agency to decide how they are going to express their worship, privately and publicly. I had a college professor who, if you were to watch him during worship, he looked like a statue. But he was one of the most worshipful people I had ever met. But he just wasn't emotive. He wasn't that kind of person who's gonna be like expressing loud emotions and body movements and stuff. So when we say, like Judas, that's not good enough, we are criticizing something that Jesus calls beautiful. And so if a person is sitting in church and they have their hands down and they are worshiping in their heart, and the worship leader says that's not good enough, that the danger is they're criticizing something that Jesus says, no, that's very beautiful.
Or if they say, everybody stand up, should be nobody sitting down, or everyone raise your hands up, and you're in a different space with God, like you don't need to do that. If you're in a church that's constantly telling you how to express your worship like this and constantly calling people out who aren't doing good enough, it creates an environment where people comply out of fear of judgment, not an authentic desire to worship in that way.
Yeah, because it pressures people into outward action without the inward authenticity.
And it creates an environment of fear and fear of judgment.
Yes.
Instead of authenticity.
That said, I'm going to be my own devil's advocate here.
Okay.
Because the flip side of that is there are times in the Psalms where the psalmist is very quite prescriptive in what to do about bowing or prostrating yourself or something like that. And so I think the kind of the middle road here is I think it's fine to invite people into certain things. If you're able to stand up or take whatever posture of worship you need to take today.
Yeah.
So you got to give permission for people to worship God as suits them best that day. Yeah. But never in the Psalms do you see emotional manipulation.
Yeah. I think the correct word, the word that you used here was invitational. So the job of a worship leader is to invite people into worship, but not to command them.
Yes.
To do anything in any way.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, let's move on and just quickly talk about his words about the poor. As mentioned, Jesus is not asking the disciples to choose between him and the poor. He's just emphasizing that in the present moment, the disciples' time with Jesus is limited. He's not discouraging ministry to the poor. In fact, it's just the opposite. In Mark 14:7, it says, you'll have the poor with you always, and whenever you want, you can do something good for them. But you won't always have me. And so the quote we gave in the meditation was the question from N.T. Wright. When we live on this other side of death and resurrection and yet still face a world of poverty, crippling debt, and all the evils that follow from them, we may find ourselves wondering whether the church has got its priorities right.
More and more from what I read in the Gospels, Jesus seems to have a very high priority on caring for the poor and the marginalized. So too, I think his churches and his followers must as well. And I think there are some that really do, and they're doing such a great job, but some have very different priorities, and some have priorities that you'd be hard pressed to find Jesus in.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we can just quickly mention Lazarus as well, because John talks about this here. So he points out Lazarus is a wanted man. And like we said last week, the chief priests is a reference to the Sadducees, and the Sadducees did not believe there was going to be a resurrection.
So if you don't believe in a resurrection, what do you do with Lazarus? So let's kill him.
Yeah, exactly. So they want to destroy the evidence rather than change their minds.
Yeah, brutal.
Okay, let's move on to the triumphal entry. Can you read the last few verses for us?
The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him. They shouted, "Hosanna! Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Blessings on the King of Israel!" Jesus found a donkey and sat on it, just as is written, "Don't be afraid, daughter Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." His disciples didn't understand these things at first. After he was glorified, they remembered that these things had been written about him, and that they had done these things to him. The crowd who had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead were testifying about him. That's why the crowd came to meet him, because they had heard about this miraculous sign that he had done. Therefore, the Pharisees said to each other, "See, you've accomplished nothing. Look, the whole world is following him."
All right. What grabs your attention there?
First of all, that I always love it when John interjects. Like, he writes the story, and then sometimes, occasionally, he writes from his perspective, 50 years later or whatever, and comes around and says, "Yeah, we didn't understand what he was saying, and then it was only later we got it. But right now, we didn't know what was going on," basically. So I always love it when he interjects. But the thing that caught my attention is that, like, I know that Jesus was very single-mindedly focused to complete his mission, but to enter Jerusalem at all at this time was basically signing the death warrant for himself and potentially his followers. And I just want to jump in front of him and be like, "Stop, don't go in there."
Yeah.
Like, he's no longer hiding. He's just out there. He's ready to die. Yeah. And also another thing I love the scene of the triumphal entry, just because we had the privilege if we went to Jerusalem and we saw the very streets on which this would have happened. And it's just a beautiful picture in my mind.
Yeah, you're right. There's a arrest warrant out for him. So, of course, walking in there is basically signing his death certificate, right?
He didn't sneak in.
No.
There's a parade for him.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So John says it's the next day. So it's Sunday. So now we're 4 days away from his arrest, 5 days away from his crucifixion, and Jesus enters Jerusalem. And we mentioned the meditation, a little bit of what that may have been like. Possibly, according to William Barclay, 2.7 million people are there. And according to Josephus, over 265,000 lambs are there to be slaughtered. So that is a very crowded, busy, and emotionally charged city. And John mentions there's two kinds of crowds here. There's the ones who witnessed the raising of Lazarus and the ones that they told about the miracle. But it's clear that this raising of Lazarus, this climactic sign in John's gospel, it has pushed the people's expectations to the extreme. And so they lined the street, they waved these date palm branches, which was a nationalistic political symbol from the Maccabean revolt, because when the Maccabeans freed Jerusalem and marched into Jerusalem, all of their followers, they all marched in waving these palm branches. And they also quote Psalm 118, which celebrates God's victory over Israel's enemy. And so with both the palm branches and the Psalm 118, they are expressing their expectation that Jesus is going to be a national, military, political savior, rescuing Israel from Rome. And in a moment, we're going to see how Jesus corrects this expectation. But it's not lost on me how we still do this today. We attach nationalism and politics to faith. And this is something that Jesus wants to correct in us. Every time we bring political power into faith, we completely miss Jesus's message in the triumphal entry.
Yeah, I wonder how many people today are looking for power in the name of Jesus. You know, like to be a Christian in some parts of the world today is synonymous with power.
And you're talking political power,
I'm
not
talking,
spiritual power.
no, I'm talking about political and military power,
Yes.
even. And when people should be remembering that this is the king who could have taken control, could have taken all this power, but chose to enter into this city on a donkey, which was a symbol of a peaceful and humble king. And so if your Jesus is a military hero who grants his followers dominion and power in this world, you might not be following the Jesus of the Gospels.
Yeah, you're right. Jesus corrects their expectations and maybe corrects our expectations as well, because he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, specifically a donkey's colt. So, not even an adult donkey. And so, Scott McKnight actually unpacks it a little further. Jesus enters Jerusalem as the world's true Lord. Strikingly and missed by no one, he enters the holy city on a donkey, an act that embodies his approach to kingship and kingdom. His rule is not by way of military victory or raw power, but by way of humility and service. Jesus did not enter on a war horse like this military conqueror would. He rides a young donkey. He is not the second coming of Simon Maccabee. He undermines what David Ford calls militant messianism with a donkey.
Yeah, and in my understanding, in times of war, kings would enter into a city on a war horse, which showed that they were going to wage war and conquer. But in times of peace, they'd enter a city on a donkey. I mean, this is a very clear symbol that everybody should have got, that this entry on a donkey symbolized he comes in peace and is peace. But
Yes.
they miss the symbol of the donkey.
Yeah.
Because they what they want is so different than what he's offering.
Yes, and as we know, when they finally realize, oh, he's going to be this kind of Messiah, not the military Messiah,
They're all out.
yeah, and their cries change from
Yeah.
Hosanna to crucify him.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the beauty in all this is that he is going to conquer an even greater enemy than their political oppressor.
Mhm.
But no one realizes it yet. And it makes me wonder how much we might miss by placing expectations on God that actually limit him to what we can imagine or our way of thinking. Not limit in the sense of he can't act outside our expectations, but limit in the sense that we miss what he does outside our expectations.
Yeah, it reminds me of the prayer in Ephesians 3, where Paul says God does more than we ever ask or imagine, and like he's beyond our expectation. So we don't even know the extent of what God does for us, and it doesn't occur to us to ask because it's like so far beyond our understanding. These people couldn't even conceive that this man riding into Jerusalem on a donkey was going to conquer death and sin. This wasn't a thought that entered their puny little minds. Like, how could they ever even imagine that? All they could see was liberation from Romans. They thought that was the best, and so that's what they expected. But they couldn't, they just had no capacity to see how great and vast God is.
Yeah. And so that prayer from Ephesians 3 makes sense. Like we need to have our mind expanded to even grasp what God has done and can do and will do for us.
Yeah, we only know like a tiny dot, a small grain of sand on the seashore instead of like the whole sand.
Yes. Let's just wrap this up now with a couple of quick points. First John mentions that while all this is going on, while Jesus is clearly sending a message about what kind of Messiah he was going to be, like you said, the disciples didn't get it until after Jesus was glorified. So in the moment, they missed it all. They missed the significance of the signs and the events.
But they got it afterwards.
And so in the meditation, we called that retrospective reflection, looking back and finding this deeper meaning and understanding than we had in the moment. And so in the meditation, I suggested journaling and the prayer of examine are two ways that we can retrospectively reflect.
I think there is great power actually if you intentionally look back at like your day, your week, whatever, the month, the year, even your life, however you retrospectively reflect on that, it always it reveals things that you never would have noticed if you hadn't taken the time to do that. Now, this is an area I definitely like to grow in. I don't often take time to look back. I definitely do it once a year. Like every year we do a huge yearly grand examine, and every time I do that, I'm like, wow, I can see patterns that God had been working through the whole year, different things that he's been saying to me that I totally missed. So yeah, I think it's a very valuable practice. And so that's why you include the examine every week, every Saturday it's published. And so I bet you for those people who are faithfully listening and meditating on the examine, I bet you they're also starting to see patterns that are starting to come up in their life, ways that God has been speaking to their life. Yeah, it's a really powerful thing to do that. How about you?
Not only that, also when we look back and say, oh, I didn't see it in the moment, but
Yeah.
now I see it.
Yeah.
The next time that happens in the future, you're like, oh, this is God. Or you're more able to see his presence in the moment because you've practiced looking back at those moments. And yeah, so for me, I used to journal a lot, and that was a great way for me to do retrospective reflection. I have not journaled lately. And honestly, it's simply because journaling became a task that I had to do to check off a box. And I thought that's not healthy, so I'm going to take a break from it. So I'm taking a break from journaling at the moment, but I do the examines, and I know I will return to journaling in the future. The last thing we should mention here is the Pharisees freak out. They say the whole world is following him, which is obviously in an exaggeration. Later in verse 31, Jesus makes reference to the ruler of the world, and that's actually who the whole world is following, and that's who Jesus has come to cast out. But this reference to the whole world in verse 19 leads us to the very next verse 20, where some Greeks come and approach Jesus, which, interestingly, as we're going to see next week, these Greeks approaching Jesus is the sign to Jesus that my time has come for my glorification.
Who knew that was the sign we were waiting for? Yeah. Anyway, we'll talk about that next week.
Yeah.
So lots of great stuff in here this week. What are some takeaways for you?
I think my one takeaway from our conversation today is just this whole idea of worship. Both the fact that some of us are wired more toward the activist side of worship, and some of us are wired more to the contemplative side. And both are beautiful to Jesus, and one should not look down on the other. And also, one should not tell the other one to be different. And leading to the idea of we have to be careful about our corporate worship and what we say and don't say, especially as worship leaders or pastors, in case we induce guilt in people or comparison, or even this idea of like, just do it on the outside so I can fit in. And inwardly though, means nothing to me.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. How about you?
I'm just really stuck on the concept that our puny little minds can't even imagine what God has for us, and we don't even know really how to pray. And so, first of all, I just encourage everyone to remember that God has far more for you than you expect or imagine. And secondly, I'd just like to close by praying this part of Ephesians 3 over everybody. And this is a template you can use yourself at home as a model for your own prayers. So, listeners, I ask that God will strengthen you in your inner selves from the riches of his glory through the Spirit. I ask that Christ will live in your hearts through faith. As a result of having strong roots in love, I ask that you'll have the power to grasp love's width and length, height and depth together with all believers. I ask that you'll know the love of Christ that is beyond knowledge, so that you will be filled entirely with the fullness of God. Glory to God, who is able to do far beyond all that we could ask or imagine by his power at work within us. Glory to him in the church and in Christ Jesus for all generations, forever and always. Amen.
Amen. I think we'll just leave that there, and we'll see you next week, listener.
Yep. Thanks for being here all the way to the end. Take care.
A Slow Journey Through John is made possible by our donors, who generously support the creation of Wild's spiritual formation content and the creation of Wild Way parishes. if you would like to help financially support The Wild Way with a tax-deductible donation, please visit thewildway.ca and click Support Us.